Grace and peace to you in the name of God the Creator, Christ the Redeemer, and the Spirit who sustains us. Amen. What does it mean to place our trust in God, to rely on God's goodness, to know that God will provide for us when things are rough, when times are hard, when we find ourselves doubting, even despairing over what the future might bring? We all have those times in our lives. Collectively, we find ourselves in one of those times right now as we face an election this week that threatens to even more deeply divide our already deeply divided country. We probably won't know on Tuesday night who wins the presidential election. It could be Saturday or later before that election is called. And so we continue to live in the anxiety of not knowing, the fear of what could be. But we also know what we can do. We can vote, and we can pray, and we can work together to find the good in the world and to be the good in the world. And we can remember that what is happening in our country right now is temporary. When we're living in the midst of turbulent history, it can feel like it will last forever. It can feel like it will only get worse, never better. But when we place our trust in God, and when we look to the story of the past to point us to the future, we are reminded that our faith is never misplaced when we place our confidence in God's goodness and not the goodness of our elected leaders. In order to understand the prophet Elijah, who we meet in our text for this morning, we need to understand Ahab. After Solomon's death, the northern tribes seceded, forming the kingdom of Israel. Ahab, the seventh king of Israel, is married to Jezebel, who is from Sidon. Together, Ahab and Jezebel abandon worship of God altogether and encourage worship of Baal and the rest of the Canaanite pantheon of gods. 1 Kings 16:30 says that Ahab did more evil in the sight of God than any king who came before him. Elijah's first appearance in the Bible is in 1 Kings 17. We know nothing of where he comes from or what his background is other than that he is bold enough to come before Ahab and challenge Baal on God's behalf, saying that God is withholding any moisture from the earth for years. Baal is the god of rain and therefore the god of life, because there can be no life without rain. So for Elijah to declare that God is putting an end to rain for years is to declare that God is more powerful than Baal, and he is a threat to Ahab's reign, particularly if he can't keep his people from starving. After this confrontation, God sends Elijah out to a stream about a day and a half's walk from Samaria, the capital city of Israel. Elijah trusts that God will keep their promise to him to keep him safe, even when that promise takes an unconventional turn. The ravens that keep him fed are considered to be an unclean bird, but even so, they are the ones that bring bread and meat to him twice a day to feed him. But eventually, the drought that he had prophesied to Ahab catches up to him east of the Jordan, and the stream where he is camped dries up. God sends him on another journey, about another 3 days' walk from the stream where he had been camped. Elijah knows that a widow in Zarephath will feed him, but she isn't aware of this. Widows are among the most vulnerable people in ancient Near East society. Women rely on their husbands to provide them with a home and some sort of income so that they can have food and shelter and protection. When their husbands die, they rely on their grown sons who take over the family business. But when they have no sons, or when their sons are children, they are destitute unless their husband's brother marries them. They rely on the charity of their community to care for and feed them. And so a drought would hit them especially hard. Now, there are a couple of interesting things about this widow that are worth lifting up. First, she is from the same country as Jezebel, so she is probably a worshiper of Baal. She's definitely not a worshiper of the God of Abraham and Sarah, and yet Elijah is sent to her rather than to a widow in Israel who is a follower of the God of Abraham and Sarah. Why is that? Is it to keep him safe from Ahab and Jezebel? Is it so that someone outside of Israel and Judah will come to know God? Is it because God senses that she has some latent faith in her? Is it so that Elijah will know that not all followers of Baal are evil, as Ahab is evil? Second, when Elijah approaches her and asks her for a piece of bread, her words echo his oath to Ahab. As God lives, she responds, signaling that about what she is about to say is just as true as what he said to Ahab about withholding rain from the earth. And things are dire. She is on her way home to make one final meal for herself and her child before they die. It is not just Ahab and Jezebel that suffer for their unfaithfulness to God. The consequences of their idolatry don't fall primarily on them, but on their people, even the faithful ones, such as Elijah, and those in the surrounding areas, such as the widow of Zarephath and her family, who suffer from the sanction of the drought that God has imposed. And so Elijah has become a guest, relying on the unkosher food provided to him first by the ravens on the edge of the desert, and then by the woman who does not observe the same dietary laws as the Israelites. Elijah is asking her to trust him, but more than that, he is asking her to trust God. Don't be afraid. Be generous with me out of your scarcity, and God will be generous with you, he says. God doesn't promise that her flour and oil will be overflowing with abundance, but God does promise that there will be enough to get the three of them through the famine. And here is yet another example of the trust the people in this story exhibit. The widow trusts that if she takes Elijah into her household, she and her household will survive the drought, even with an extra mouth to feed. And Elijah trusts that God will provide for them, even in a way that is unconventional, outside the bounds of propriety. A strange man from a foreign land moving in with a widow and her child. I wonder what their neighbors in Zarephath thought of this strange arrangement. And I wonder if their thinking changed when this strange household did not run out of food, even as the drought progressed. But then that trust is tested in a very profound way when the widow's child dies. Only one thing has changed. She has brought a stranger into her home. It's natural that she blames him and his God for her child's death, but he refuses to accept her accusation because he knows it isn't true. He knows that God didn't kill the child, and so he pleads with God to bring the child back to life. Everything that Elijah does points to God. From his first words to Ahab, when he declares his obedience and faithfulness to God, to his willingness to go where God sends him and trusting God to provide, to his trust that God will restore the child's life. And so the widow can say that she knows for certain that the words in his mouth are truly the words of God. It doesn't matter what we say if our actions don't cause others to trust God. Are we generous with our scarcity as well as our abundance? Do we trust God in times of doubt and despair as well as in times of joy and certainty? There are many reasons why God could have sent Elijah to the widow of Zarephath. In the end, the thing that matters is that she was willing to trust Elijah and to trust in God to see her through the hard times. Amen.